And we are live. There's some people joining us today. Just going to turn on the lights a little bit. Hello, everybody. If you can write in the chat section if there are some of you that are going to be joining. I started this stream a little bit earlier, about 9 minutes earlier, so I'll give some time for others to join in. So hi to everybody that is currently joining the stream. And there's a lot of things to cover today. A lot of things. And before I begin, Merry Christmas. Of course, yesterday was December 25th. And this is the very first official Christmas that Ukraine celebrates on December 25th and not on the other calendar, which is in January, which is back in the days now. That used to be, the tradition is celebrating it 2 weeks after. So I have my first viewers have joined. We have Hugh. Hello from Ontario. Blast. Hello to my Ontarians. Hey ho, greetings from Germany and Merry Christmas. Thank you, Dr. Tusto. Merry Christmas to you. Darren. Hi, Chris. Hi, Darren. Ozi Buga. Merry Christmas from Cambodia. Yes, you were the viewer I was talking about in my last live stream last week that is from Cambodia. So thank you from joining from Cambodia, and I have to visit Cambodia, especially that part of the world, Laos, Vietnam. There's a lot of beautiful countries out there. Merry Christmas from Wales. Thank you, Harry. Merry Christmas to you and your family and your close ones. And now we have the new year coming up, so I hope that you all are getting prepared for the new year as well. Meritax Land, Maryland. I'm not really sure what is Meritax Land. Oh, okay, I get it. Meritax Land. Okay, I was like, where is Meritax Land? But I get where you're coming from. Kirk Peterson, hey, and Merry Christmas from the East Coast of Canada. Kirk, where are you from, if I may ask, in the East Coast? Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island. I'm curious to hear. And it's a beautiful part of Canada as well. The Maritimes is an amazing, slow-paced but beautiful part of Canada. PEI, my friend, and I have been to PEI. It's a very windy island, and it was really a nice experience actually going to PEI because I've only seen pictures of it, and of course when you cross to go to PEI, you have to go through the Confederation Bridge, which was built, I believe, in 1992, which is, I think, the longest bridge in Canada, which connected finally PEI with, I believe it was with New Brunswick. And that was a huge achievement. And so, yeah, it was fun to go to PI. It's a very small island, but beautiful. Lots of potatoes. Maryland, yes. They're in. Привіт, мій брате. Привіт, Music Man. Thank you for joining. Ozi Buga is mentioning that Cambodia is wonderful. Please let me know if you come and you have a free bed and guide in Kampot. Absolutely. I'll let you know, Ozi. Got to start planning. I'm from California. Nice. Where are you from, specifically in California? I worked on that bridge from start. Oh, no way, Kirk. Really? That's crazy. Yeah, I mean, it probably employed so many people from PEI. I'm not surprised. It's a huge project. So that's really impressive. Good job, man. Sacramento. Okay, nice. Central California. I've never been to California, so I should go one day as well. There's, the longer you live on this planet, the more you realize that traveling around the world is difficult, but it's a must, because you get to interact with so many different people. You learn a lot from them. And also your experience and your perspective on this world changes a lot when you meet and you go around the world and you see how people live differently, And so that's why I need to put a priority for my 2024 resolution to perhaps start getting, more out, because I don't travel that much, and I have traveled in the past, but it's kind of difficult sometimes. When you say PI, I think of Philippine Islands. No, PEI. So this is a province in Canada, the Prince Edward Island, but not Philippine Islands. Denmark. Hello to Denmark. You do not understand where you come from until you have other places compared with, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's why actually bring us to the Russians is most of the Russians don't travel out of Russia. These, especially the older crowd, which are just literally relying purely on pensions that are being given by the government. They don't have any spare change to go and see the world. They think the West, as they always call it, the evil West is out to get them, but they never really experienced it, right? They never went to the United States. And that was one of the very first shocks, actually, of these Soviet leaders that first went to the United States. And they would see the wealth that the United States had, that they had what you had grocery stores full of food. When in the Soviet Union, many of the people that lived through, and I guess some of you can say and prove that you could barely, you had no selection. People were waiting and queuing in line to wait for bread and just basic staple food. So when you can compare and you can see how other people live, you question a lot of the things in your life, and sometimes it's for the better or for the worse, right? And it expands your perspectives. Okay, so I have been following Ukraine closely. So this is Music Man who's writing. I've been following Ukraine closely for the last 2 years, and I've been learning everything I can, include the language. Have nothing but respect for Ukraine or Ukrainians worldwide. Thank you, and yeah, I think again, it's really impressive that some of you are also trying to adopt the culture and learn Ukrainian culture. It's not easy, and especially the language itself is difficult for people that the Latin alphabet is completely different from the Cyrillic, the Ukrainian, the Slavic alphabet. So my advice to you is to find Ukrainians that you can talk to in Ukrainian, watch Ukrainian shows, movies, and that's one of the best ways to learn any language. It's a typical advice, but it's very true that you need to surround yourself with people that speak Ukrainian. I'm also at fault with that in here because I don't surround myself with too many Ukrainians, like speaking with them in Ukrainian. So it would take me a few weeks to get like to perfect, excellent Ukrainian, just because I don't speak enough of it and I don't, you know, interact as much. So thank you, Music Man, for that. From Slovenia, thank you, Slovenia. Florida Man here, Slavo Ukraine. Need to apologize for showing up late. Don't worry, Surfer. Yeah. So I was about to start this at 5. I started a little bit earlier at 4:50. Apologies. I just couldn't wait to start the live stream. I was very excited to do this today. Yeah, so again, big Merry Christmas to all of you. For those that celebrate, or if you have any other type of holidays, happy holidays to you guys. And also we're having the new year coming up soon. So I hope that you guys enjoyed yesterday with your family, your friends. You had some fun talking about family stuff, whatever. So that stays in your family. Lol, I couldn't wait for this either. Thank you for sharing the enthusiasm to be here. Honestly, it's kind of funny because I wanted to do this live stream mainly because of the huge successes that Ukraine had the past week in terms of shutting down multiple Russian jets. But yesterday night, as I was about to go to sleep, we had another amazing Christmas present delivered thanks to the storm shadows, and they've been delivering many Christmas presents, but throughout the year to the Russians. But this is a big one, and I think most of you have already heard about what happened last night in Feodosia in Crimea, with the Ukrainians destroying, pulverizing a Russian landing ship. And this is the second landing ship that the Russian of this scale that the Russians have lost in the last 2 years. From Quebec, again, Slava Ukraine. What air defense doing? Yeah, I love this meme, but it's funny. The Russians have no air defense of Crimea. They might continuously move some S-300s, S-400s somewhere, but Ukraine easily destroys them, and Russia doesn't have unlimited air defense systems, right? It would rather prioritize, in my opinion, perhaps Donbass or its own territory because it doesn't want to get embarrassed with the Ukrainians flying long-range drones towards Moscow or St. Petersburg or other oblasts. So, of course, Russia doesn't have limited air defense. So, I think that Crimea at this point is, there's very little defenses that the Russians can use to destroy these very high tech Western weapons. The Storm Shadows have proven themselves to be excellent weapons, and Ukraine has utilized them very well since the summer, since they've acquired them in late spring. So this was a fantastic hit, and that's what I'm going to start this live stream with. Is well, the landing ship that we're talking about is Novocherkassk, which was built by Poland in Gdansk, and then given to the Soviet Army, Soviet Navy. And so the Russians have been using Novocherkassk as a transport ship as well. And according to reports, at the moment of the strike, and why we've seen that video of this massive explosion, literally looked like a mini nuclear detonation in Feodosia, is because apparently it had 2,000 or over 2,000 Shahed drones that it was carrying at that moment. And that's why it exploded. The explosion was massive. Again, it's not confirmed if it is or those were Shaheds or just regular ammunition that the Russians were transporting. But is either way, it's massive, and I really hope it's the Shaheds because the Russians have been utilizing them again in far greater amounts in the winter. The new terrorist campaign has started for the Russians almost on a daily basis now. They're flying Shaheeds and launching long range missiles to attack Ukrainian cities. So, this is a huge win for Ukraine. And before I read your comments again, guys, I just want to mention that this is what Ukraine needs to be repeating on a weekly basis. This is what gets the West's attention, unfortunately, when you have a nice video of a big explosion, everybody from the BBC to CNN, basically report on that, and that's bringing back the narrative into Ukraine, which is very important as well. Don't forget that this is also an information war, and for the last few weeks, there's been a feeling like more and more people have sort of forgotten about the conflict going on in Ukraine. Okay, so let's go back to your comments. West Michigan, Jennison. Thank you. What Michigan? It's a lovely, lovely state. I heard from several sources that those jets were actually shut down by F-16s. What do you think? Are you mentioning the Su-34s? Entirely possible, but there's been no visual confirmation that the F-16s have been delivered yet. So I don't think it was F-16s. According to the reports, it was Patriot system that was moved closer to the front line. Perhaps Ukraine moved two of them in the Zaporizhia direction, one in the Kherson direction, to trap Russian jets that are either flying out of Russia, mainland Russia, or from Crimea as well, because the Russians have multiple air bases on the Crimean Peninsula that they're utilizing to also depart and attack then Ukrainian positions. I'm originally from Saginaw. And oh yeah, Saginaw. I think it's a very familiar name. Is that northern Michigan, like closer to Lake Superior? That is very barren territory as well. People think Michigan is like this super urban state, but half of the state is so wild, and that's really cool as well. And Lake Superior area is beautiful. Well, we need more big booms then. Yeah, totally agree, Surfer. That is very true. As I said, Ukraine needs to repeat these events on a weekly basis, whether it be this Novocherkassk landing ship that got pulverized yesterday, or, other events like the Su-34s being destroyed. That needs to happen on a weekly basis. And I'm thinking now that Ukraine is obviously going to do a one final blow attack on the Crimean Bridge in 2024. At least that's my wish list for 2024. I think it's going to happen. Zaluzhny, Budanov, and everybody that is, fighting this war in Ukraine understand the importance of absolutely obliterating that Russian bridge that is illegal. The Russians are heavily reliant on that bridge, obviously, to move supplies to the south in Kherson and Zaporizhia. It will cripple them, but not to the point that it will change the tide of the war, but it will be a very, very serious blow to the Russians. It's Eastern Michigan. Okay, cool. Everyone has a device and would have filmed something by now just out of excitement. F-16s will happen soon. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it would have been would have been easy to know if there were F-16s already in Ukraine. I think that there would be some picture somewhere floating around. But again, I've seen a report today that mentioned that some Ukrainian pilots finished basic training on the F-16s in England, in the UK. So that was confirmed today, and also that some Ukrainian technicians and engineers have also been training and undergoing basic training for maintenance of the F-16s, because this is not just about the pilots, it's also about the logistics behind maintaining such a high-tech jet fighter like the F-16. So, of course, I understand the complexity behind that as well. It's not like the partners, the Ukrainian allies, just say tomorrow, oh, we're ready to give the F-16s, and next week Ukraine's going to receive them. I understand that there was a long process to form and train the pilots, train the technicians, have to make sure you have the right infrastructure for these jet fighters. And so there's a lot of training and learning as well from the Ukrainian side, which is why it took, it still takes a very long time before we see the F-16s in Ukraine. Crimea has become a bad place for Russia. Their position deteriorated big time. Yeah, but at the same time, the Russians will hold on to Crimea until the very, very end. There's no amount of these, daily occurrences of the Novocherkasks and their air bases, blowing up will deter the Russians and force them to leave Crimea. They will stay there until the very end. So there's also complexity behind that, because that they will also fight tooth and nail for what they're currently controlling. And they have turned Crimea into a massive fortress. Perhaps it's not very well defended from the air, but it's a huge fortress, multiple military bases. They still have the bridge link, and they will do no matter, they will take whatever it takes to defend and keep Crimea for themselves, which they have illegally annexed from Ukraine. Maintenance is just as complex for training and takes a lot of experience. Exactly. And these are, not Soviet jet fighters. We're talking about high tech, Western tech. So there's also complexity of the language barriers and certain things that maybe these Ukrainian techs don't yet understand. So Ukraine, however, has shown an absolute huge capacity to be able to learn and have the desire to learn quickly, right? We've seen how quickly they've adopted the new tanks, the Leopards, various IFVs, APCs, and different, very high tech weaponry that the Ukrainian soldiers have mastered in the last few years. So this is very impressive as well. This shows how committed Ukraine is to win against Russia. So yeah, that is the one update I want to talk about, is obviously this huge explosion that happened in Feodosia and the successful strike on the Russian Black Sea Fleet. And again, some of you might not have understood what I mentioned in my community post today, but this ship itself did not represent 20% of the Black Sea Fleet. Of course, Russia has many vessels, but since February 2022, 20% of the Russian Black Sea Fleet has been wiped out. That is huge, especially considering that Ukraine has no navy whatsoever. I think going back to that very essential narrative that Ukraine without a navy was able to find multiple ways to just obliterate the Russian Black Sea Fleet is huge again, and it goes back to the topic of the Ukrainians doing whatever is necessary to win against Russia. But this is a huge win, and overall, this 20% accounts for 23 vessels, 23 that Russia has lost since February 2022. And they range from various sizes, but the biggest ones were Moskva. Moskva was a huge one, the flagship, as they say, of the Black Sea Fleet, the Orsk, and this one, the Cherkasks, are massive, massive ships as well. The submarine that was destroyed in September as well. Russia even managed to lose a submarine. Like, how ridiculous is that as well? It's crazy. So 20%, it's a good start, but we need to get to 100%. So they will not pose a threat anymore. And to be honest, even at this point, the Russian Black Sea Fleet doesn't really pose a threat anymore. They obviously, there's still, I think, a threat left, obviously, but you've seen them trying to hide these vessels further and further down the Black Sea. Now, as I've mentioned in my last live stream, they've started building a new port somewhere in Georgia. Uh, so the Russians are trying to get away further and further away from Crimea. So this is also another big embarrassment for their fleet. Not to say that the Russians ever had a good navy. They were always embarrassed because they can't control the seas and the oceans. And this is another reason why Russia is not a global superpower. If you can't control your own seas like the United States does or other countries that have, good functional navies, you shouldn't be considered as a global superpower. That's why China has been heavily investing into its navy. Now, whether they're good or not is, another question. We've never seen them in action, but China has been investing heavily into building dozens of ships per year, because they want to get to the same level as the United States, which I don't think they obviously will get to because the United States has experience as well, with their navy. So, anyways, that just brings me back to the topic that the Russians don't control their seas and they're being utterly embarrassed by a nation without a navy. So that tells you how well they would perform against a country with a navy. Going back to your comments, Russia is the second best army in Ukraine. That is correct. Cats. Um, Russian Nazi lost 2 ships. Not sure what you're meaning by that. But yeah, I guess there was another report that from this Novocherkassk event, there was also a small little ship that was very close to it, which also was damaged or destroyed. And I believe it was some small training ship that was close to it. And again, why Feodosia? Feodosia is obviously in Crimea. And actually, there's been another explosion that happened. I remember I reported on it, whether it was last week or 2 weeks ago, on the port of Feodosia. The Russians use this as a port to transfer weapons because it's directly connected to the railway that travels through the Crimean Peninsula and then heads into Kherson and Zaporizhia. So Feodosia is a very important key port city for the Russian navy and military. Can Ukraine mass produce cheap, simple demining machines, like use old tractors or something smaller, says Hannah. Um, I'm not sure if there is a capacity. Again, do you want to just convert tractors into demining vehicles? I'm assuming that it would be difficult to do that. But I know that the West does have technology and they have built different types of tanks that are meant to be demining machines. So Ukraine, I think in conjunction of receiving also support from the West, I would agree that we need to develop a mass produce some cheap, simple demining machines. So far as I'm concerned, I don't think Ukraine has that, and it hasn't really put a priority on that. But it's a good point that a priority also needs to be put on that. Again, Ukraine doesn't have limited resources, so it needs to really, I think, prioritize. And right now, the priority has been mostly on drones because they're far more cost effective than even massively produced tractors that or demining machines. It's more expensive to produce that. But I still do believe, and I agree with your comment, that this also needs to be in the top 3 priorities or top 5 priorities for the Ukrainian military and government to also find ways to demine, because Ukraine, unfortunately, is the most mined country in the world. That is a fact. Millions of mines, if not hundreds of millions of mines, have been laid by the Russians. And as they say in some of these articles, it will take centuries before Ukraine can get away from this legacy of mines. And we know that most of them are located right now in Zaporizhia, but also on the Eastern Front, and most likely in Kherson, as the Russians right now are also trying to develop some sort of multi echelon defense in the Kherson region, where the Ukrainians are trying to push out the Russians from the left bank. So, unfortunately, Ukraine carries that title of being the most mined country in the world. And it breaks my heart because, as I've mentioned in my videos, the south of Ukraine is one of the most fertile territory in Ukraine. Everybody knows about the Kherson watermelons, or maybe some of you don't know, but kavun in Kherson were always delicious and will be continue to be delicious. But unfortunately, so much of that fertile land in the south of Ukraine has been, pretty much rendered useless. And unfortunately, as we've heard as well, some of these liberated areas of Kherson, the farmers right now that were plowing the fields, many of them end up dead or injured because they drive their tractors through mines that are, obviously haven't been cleared up yet. So that is another huge tragedy, and the dark nature of this invasion, this illegal invasion from Russia, which is very brutal against the Ukrainians. Lots of amputees here, yeah, and I know that's an issue with Cambodia as well with the mines. The legacy lasts decades. Yeah, well, Ozzy, I know about that, especially that region. Burma, Cambodia, or Burma was the old name of Cambodia. um, it's just nasty what happens. You can't obviously clear up 100% of these mines, so they somewhat stay forever. And when they don't, when somebody steps on them is when obviously you clear that up. But it's horrifying. Imagine you're walking, you don't know if your next step will be the last one. So Myanmar, correct. Does anyone follow Istori Vovka Diki YouTube? I'm not sure who that is. Surfer. Hey Chris, hello from Long Island. Hi to New Yorkers. Hello to Long Island. I see it like I don't understand why the West won't let them use their missiles in Russian territory. We have Russia using weapons from North Korea, from China, from Iran, and Ukrainian territory. Yeah, Joshua, I mean, I agree. It's mainly a fear of escalation, and it truly exists. That's why there's also rumors that the United States or Ukraine allies don't want Ukraine to have a full victory because they're afraid of the consequences of a massive Russian collapse as well, when it will fracture into multiple states, and then you don't know if you could end up with multiple rogue states that have nuclear weapons, which is another fear. One thing is that Putin, the piece of crap that he is as a human being, he's a predictable leader, and the West has interacted with Putin for the last 23 years. So they understand him, might not, always understand what he does, but it's a person that they have seen how he acts, and now you get to kind of understand him. But when it's a ruptured country, you have a power vacuum, which inevitably will happen in Russia. There's no denying that there will be power vacuum, being that they're a kleptocracy. It's a mafia state where everybody, like Prigozhin, there is thousands of them, people with power, with influence. They're just waiting for the right moment to, have a low peace or a big piece. It really depends, but there will be a power vacuum when Russia collapses. It's a matter of time. Again, I'm not saying it's going to happen in 2 years. It could be 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, but it will happen. And this is very cyclical in Russia. I hope it doesn't start over again when Russia collapses. It will just turn itself into another kleptocracy eventually. I think the goal as well here in my message is that we want to turn Russia into a democracy. And I don't think it's right to say that they're somewhat inferior, that they don't have the capacity to do that. I think they just need to be guided. Just like Germany was guided in World War II and became a fantastic society a few generations later, when we saw what they did in World War II, and the global mindset of the German society was atrocious, right? Everybody was pretty much in line with the Holocaust and what they were doing. They believed they were the superior nation, truly fanatical. And look where Germany is right now. And the German people are truly ashamed of their past, even though right now the current generation doesn't carry that burden. They weren't part of that. But there needs to be um, not only punishment given to these people, but then an education given to Russia's society to explain to them that what they did was atrocious to the Ukrainians, and what they continue currently doing as well is atrocious. It will take a lot of decades. Don't get me wrong, but you know, I think Russia has the capacity to come back into fully, um, you know, a true democracy and worthy of its name. It's not going to be in the same format, this big Russia, but I think that maybe in a smaller territory, Russia could become a great country. So I don't want to always talk smack about the Russians. There's a lot of them that are also fighting against the Putin regime, but there's not enough of them, unfortunately, at this point, and they're a minority. Um, Burma and Cambodia are on the opposite sides of Thailand. Okay. Should give a shout out to Ukraine EOD, this YouTuber's from the United Kingdom, and he goes to Ukraine to help demine Ukraine. Shout out to this man. Actually, I might check him out after. Yeah, Britain and the British people have really given a lot to the Ukrainians, and they were one of the very first European nations that fully support Ukraine from day one. Boris Johnson flew to Ukraine. He was one of the first leaders that flew to Ukraine after the invasion, and he supports. Now, obviously, Boris Johnson is no longer in power; it's Rishi Sunak. But there's been a consistency, no matter who the leader was in Britain, to support Ukraine. And that I really appreciate. That there was no divergence, as we've seen, with other nations. That especially if, let's say, the United States will elect Trump, what Trump is going to do with Ukraine on that question. Can Ukraine sustain the war without full support from the United States? Um, Guerrilla warfare. I don't think it would sustain the type of war that is currently ongoing, that we're seeing. So Ukraine holding the entire line of defense would be very difficult because Russia, again, it's not just supplying itself; it's feeling very safe from its territory, but it's also receiving a lot of help from China, Iran, North Korea, and other partner countries that are helping Russia. And so I think that without the United States, Ukraine would definitely not be fighting the current lines. And so it would be guerrilla warfare at this point because, yeah, the Ukrainian army heavily depends on ammunition from the West. So, um, yeah, I don't think Ukraine would be able to sustain this massive scale war by itself only. And truly, what kind of nation would be able to do that by themselves? Right? Every single war, no, if I'm comparing it to World War II, the scale of devastation, the reason why they were able to, the Axis and allies were fighting for so long is because they were partnered with other countries, right? And Ukraine needs partners. Ukraine cannot fight this alone, right? Ukraine is willing to use its manpower, its own society, to fight the Russians, but it still needs support, whether it be in ammunition, in military assistance, financial assistance. Ukraine cannot do it alone, and that there's nothing wrong with asking for help. You know, we all got somewhere because of help from others. Poland and Bulgaria were really important. The US will get aid going again. The recent US Defense Act set up an office in the Inspector General oversight for Ukraine aid. I only can hope so. US Republicans need to support Ukraine ASAP. I agree. And again, this is not to talk smack about the Republicans. I think the Republicans, it's a fantastic party, which, first of all, let's not forget, has abolished slavery. That was the party that abolished slavery. And Abraham Lincoln was one of the most influential American presidents in US history. So the Republicans have a lot of history backing them as the good people that supported some of the most important changes, not only in the United States, but in the world. But right now, unfortunately, there's a reversal. And the Republican Party, whether it be Russian influence that's within the party, I don't know, but is really known as pro-Russia party. And there's a lot of old school Republicans that are still, fighting against this. But it's unfortunate what's currently happening. Um, you know, so I hope that this will change eventually, but especially with Trump, everybody's really trying to copy him right now. And the only, I think, candidate in the Republican Party, Nikki Haley, is the only one that is currently supporting to continue aiding Ukraine. Whereas there is there's a few other candidates like DeSantis and the other one that I don't want to mention because he's not very he's tried to pose himself as Trump 2.0, Rivek, I think, or Vivek Ramaswamy. I might have butchered his name, but they're spewing out Russian propaganda left and right. So especially Vivek. So I hope that Nikki somehow goes on top, and that is one of the most important things. Continues to support Ukraine. There's a select few Republicans that have been able to slow things down. Yeah, Nikki Haley, 2024. I would definitely support her. Just mainly, again, I don't know all of her policies, so I apologize for that. But in terms of continuing support for Ukraine, that is extremely important because that also guarantees safety, global safety for the next decades when Russia is defeated. right? So this is an investment not just to Ukraine but global stability, and that I think that message needs to be more frequent in the United States, because a lot of people think that, especially less educated people that don't really know the context, the historical context of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, this is just some misunderstanding between both nations, that if we just sit down and talk about it, well, everything's going to be resolved and we're not going to be having these issues in the future. And it's a very simple-minded perspective on this conflict. This has global implications. If Russia wins, it sends out a message to China, North Korea, the Irans of our current world, that they can get away with these types of invasions, and the world, will sort of half-ass it, their response against them. Hello, Nicholas. Thank you. I always see your comments. Hi, Nicholas. I believe you're from the Netherlands. What impact do you think it will have that Belarus now has tactical nuclear weapons delivered from Russia? I mean, to be honest, nothing has changed, right? It's just nuclear bravado. It doesn't make or change anything else. Russia is Kaliningrad, and Kaliningrad is actually closer to old Europe, and they have nuclear weapons there than Belarus is. So, I mean, it's just some, saber rattling from Lukashenko and Putin. They're trying to scare us into them using, nuclear weapons. And there is no difference whether they are in Belarus or somewhere in Vladivostok or in Kaliningrad. They're there, and I don't think the Russians are going to use them, because nobody again is threatening Russia directly. Nobody's invading Russia. Nobody wants to invade them. Everybody's interested right now, especially in Europe, in peace. Nobody wants another world war, and I think that Putin, in my personal opinion, is a rational person, right? I don't think he's going to start launching nukes because nobody's attacking his state. He just is afraid because he's afraid of the influence that a prosperous Ukraine, a prosperous Finland, right at the border of Russia, can do to his regime. Right? Let's not forget about that as well. That is one of the reasons why he wants to keep Ukraine in a state of war, always influence its politics, because if Ukraine succeeds, the Russians will ask themselves questions. So Ukraine succeeded into being a free, strong economic country, which I believe Ukraine has the capacity to become a country like that because it has the resources and the will. And the Russians will ask themselves the same questions. We're told that we're the greatest nation, and they can't escape that because they're right by the border of Ukraine, right? So, yeah, Virginia, says Nicholas, and educated in Canada. Cool, nice. Virginia is a very beautiful state. Haley is the best of the Republican candidates other than Christie, but he doesn't have a chance. Yeah, and I believe Christie was the old mayor of, or the governor of New Jersey. But yeah, in terms of if we're comparing this Christie to Haley, I think Haley has a much greater chance. But the polls right now, and polls can always lie, but don't seem to be in her favor yet. And Trump still has, unfortunately, the majority of the support right now. And most people are expecting him to be the leader of the Republican Party for next year's elections against Biden. So, unfortunately, I really don't hope to see that, because whatever you think of Trump, one thing is that he is a pro-Russian agent, and he has really mentioned multiple times that he has really good relations with Putin, the best ones. So, unfortunately, I think that we know where this is going if Trump will get elected in 2024, which I'm crossing my fingers won't happen. Maybe Trump will drop from eating too much junk food. Yeah, he certainly does like his junk food as well. That's for sure. Yeah. So the other thing I wanted to mention, so we've strayed away more to the American politics, but is on my main topic was also about the bad week for the Russian Air Force. It was a catastrophic week for the Russians. They've lost multiple Su-34s, the three of them on December 22nd. And then on Christmas Eve, I didn't make a video, but now I'm mentioning it. So obviously, an Su-30 was destroyed close to Odessa, that was flying towards Odessa, and another one close to Mariupol. So that was an Su-34 that they lost. And also last week, the Russians were attacked. So a Russian airbase was attacked by Ukrainian long-range drone, which allegedly also damaged two Su-34s. So a lot of damage, a lot of destroyed air assets as well. And one of you actually mentioned a comment in my video that I posted about, this covering the Su-34s that were downed in the south. Mentioned that it's not just obviously the price tag of losing such expensive modern aircraft, right? These were modern bombers that were, I think, came into service in 2014, so rather modern, and they have a price tag of 50 million a piece, so that is USD, so very expensive. But also the pilots, right? Because these pilots were killed, a few of them were killed, up to 6 pilots that lost their lives, the Russian pilots. And it's difficult to replace flying orcs as well, right? It's easier to replace a terrestrial orc that's currently fighting in Avdiivka than replacing a flying one, and that takes a lot of time. All jokes aside, training a pilot takes a lot of time. There's the theory, there's a lot of flying hours. You can't just, in a week learn the basics of flying an Su-34 or a MiG-29. You're flying supersonic aircraft. So the replacement cost is huge in Russia, and they will have less and less experienced pilots, evidently, that won't be able to adequately react to difficult situations, whether it be a missile or doing a dogfight. I mean, these newer Russian pilots, they're being trained, won't have the skill set, and that's why they've been recalling the Russian Air Force some of these old farts that flew these planes a few decades ago, that have a big beer belly, but they were like, whatever. I mean, I guess let's do another run. That's why Russia's been doing the last few months as well. Okay. Hi, Vicky. Thanks, Chris, for another live stream. Thank you for joining. Blue Putis mentions Chris. He's more than an agent. Yeah, I agree. That was about Trump. The golden shower story was Russian propaganda. Hill Dog paid. Yeah, I don't know. Not something I'm really interested in either. Repeating Russia propaganda is nasty. Da, da. Cheryl mentions, my nephew said his parents are voting for Trump because he's fun and entertaining. They love him because it's kind of like an addiction. I mean, yeah, as I said, it's not to belittle people when I mention that they're not educated. They just, part of Trump's, I guess, support comes from these more rural, more uneducated areas of the United States. And so, unfortunately, people don't really do a lot of research about what his actual policies are, what is his track record, what kind of baggage does he have as a politician, a credible politician. And to each of these questions, there's not a lot of answers, right? Trump is not a man, a political man. He doesn't have that, but he's a very good showman, right? And that is also very important when we're talking about elections and being a president. Being a showman sometimes helps. So I might understand some of the people that initially voted for Trump. The slogan of making America great again is, it hits everybody, right? You want your country to be greater. You want your country sometimes to return to its roots, right? But um, at the same time, Trump doesn't really know how to build an efficient administration. And we've seen the chaos that existed during his reign, his 4-year tenure as a president. So, yeah. Also, a bad week for the Russian Navy. Yeah, I mentioned that day glow. That was my first starting half an hour. I talked about the obvious situation that occurred in with the Novocherkassk landing ship. So now I've went on to talk about the Russian Air Force, or the air farce, because what is good as well about what happened this week with these multiple expensive jet fighters being down is that they're not flying them anymore, or very little missions now in the south. The Ukrainians have reported right after this huge day of 3 shut down Su-34s. The next day, the Russians absolutely flew none of them in the left bank. And as I've mentioned as well, the Russians are definitely flying them and launching glide bombs at Ukrainian positions at left bank. Right, this is one of the efficient ways Russia utilizes to try to dislodge the Ukrainian presence in the left bank. So by destroying these Su-34s, more and more the Russians have no confidence to fly them very close to the front line, or not flying them whatsoever to the front line. Okay, so JC mentions that he wants to move to Ukraine. That's cool, and I hope that that's going to work out for you. There's a lot of beautiful Ukrainian cities that thankfully have remained untouched, or mostly untouched by the Russian missiles. That is another thing that really hurts me, is all these destroyed Ukrainian cities. Mariupol, the biggest tragedy of them all. A city that was pre-war about 450K in population, absolutely annihilated. And the Russians have tried to pretend that they've been rebuilding Mariupol, but overall, we know that they're not going to do that. So, unfortunately, Bakhmut, Marinka, Mariupol, and a lot of other cities have been absolutely, destroyed by Russia. And that's what they leave behind. Ukraine set a brilliant trap for the Russian aircraft. Absolutely, right? I think that if you're looking at the map, right, the higher south area, so Zaporizhia, and then you have the left bank. So Ukraine might have moved two Patriot systems from in the south and in the east towards the left bank of Kherson, and they kind of just knew the Russians would be flying, and so it was a perfect trap to catch them, right? Because the range of these batteries, these air defenses is fantastic. So, and it really speaks volumes of the quality of these systems that Ukraine has received as well in the last few months, to protect its skies. And remember, the first few weeks of the full scale invasion, where Ukraine was asking NATO close the skies. Well, finally, we can say that most of the Ukraine sky is closed for business, for Russian business, which is great. Now it's more about the front line that Ukraine needs to control, which is obviously harder. And obviously, Ukraine's not going to be moving Patriot missiles and air defense systems in the front line. They're way too expensive for that. So that is now the new challenge, is really setting traps for the active battlefields, front lines that Ukraine is currently facing. The BS of not attacking the Russian Federation territory needs to go away. I agree. I mean, it needs to be tit for tat, right? If Russia can strike Ukraine with impunity, and especially civilian targets, I mean, why can't Ukraine target exclusively just Russian military targets in Russia? Why is that such a, like a why is there so many strings attached when Ukraine receives weapons? Why is Ukraine being denied the right to strike military targets in Russia? And we're not talking about civilian targets. We're talking about exclusively hitting Russian military targets, which Ukraine has been doing effectively, secretly as well, last few months, especially in 2023, with the increase of um, long range production of drones, the long range drone production. We've seen that the Ukrainian military has been launching more and more of them towards the Russia's direction. But whenever Ukraine receives Western weapons, they cannot utilize them against Russian targets in Russia, which is unfortunate. Or Ukraine always needs to somewhat hide the fact that they've utilized them. So that sucks. And I hope that in 2024, that will change. This approach will change. Now I'm going to have a little sip of tea. I'm going to read your comments. Героям слава, слава Україні. I still dream of a bridge flying high. Yes, that's exactly what I was mentioning, is the Crimean bridge. I really hope is going to be not flying high, but sinking very low. When will Russia run out of tanks? They were supposed to have about 10,000 in total, but we have now lost over half as far as I am concerned. Yeah, there's multiple videos and reports and like many different articles that mention and try to analyze exactly how many Russia has. As far as I'm concerned, I think it was, what was it, Covert Cabal? I think that's the channel where he did an analysis on how many tanks Russia has currently still in reserve. And I believe they came around 2 to 3,000 still that Russia has left. So Ukraine knocked down, if Russia, let's say, started with 10,000. Now I think the reports mention about 5,000 more or less that Ukraine has destroyed. Again, the numbers, they're so high. I often forget how many Ukraine destroyed up to this day. But for sure, Russia still has a few thousand There's no denying that they've been stockpiling tanks since the Cold War, and maybe even if half of them are non-functional, we've seen how we're going to start noticing the Russians run out of tanks. When we're not going to be seeing any more of them. It's as obvious as it is. And we've seen that the Russians continue to send T-62s, T-55s, T-54s, different T-72 variants, even the T-90s. They have a lot of them still, much less, but I think they still have enough for about a year or two of full-scale fighting, like the one that we've seen in the last 2 years. So the numbers are very different. I can't exactly tell you when, but for sure, Russia has thousands of them left. Could be 1,500, 2,000, 3,000. Nobody really knows because Russia even themselves sometimes don't even know. You've seen some of these images, or maybe you haven't, but like these satellite images taking pictures of these massive warehouses or these scrapyards full of old Russian tanks that have been in storage in open. Like they weren't in hangars or anything. They were out in the open. Just the quality of the of stocking them is atrocious, right? So, um, but Russia's been stockpiling a lot of them. So it's difficult to know how many actually work, but we know that they've been stealing and selling parts of their tanks for years. Yeah, exactly. There's also, even before 2022, a lot of these tanks, nobody thought that Russia would ever utilize them again. So a lot of them went in the black market. You have some regular Russian in Siberia that probably is driving his T-72 to work. I'm joking, but a lot of these legacy Soviet tanks have been also sold to the black market, whether it be for parts, or Russia also selling a lot of its tanks to the market, right? Russia's also tried and is currently also selling its weapons to developing countries like India, Venezuela, and Africa. So also there's also that aspect. I think obviously now they're not prioritizing that because they really need every single last thing that they have, but they've also lost a lot of these things because they've sold them. So um, I don't exactly know what the numbers currently are, but for sure, with what we've been seeing in the Russians, continuing on their offensives, I still think they have a lot of them for sure. Okay, so let's answer some more questions. Da, da. Did you see the second Battlestar Galactica? I'm afraid I don't watch Battlestar Galactica, Darren. I'm not very familiar with that universe. Trump can barely read. No, I don't. I'm not going to go up that far, but he certainly doesn't know a lot about geopolitics. When? Da, da. Yeah. So that is the situation with the Russian Air Force. Now, another thing I wanted to mention today is Zaluzhny had a press conference. Surprisingly, I haven't seen a press conference being done by Zaluzhny. Um, Again, it was very short. It was half an hour. But it was one important thing that I think we need to take away from this press conference. He mentioned that 2024 will be a much different year than 2023. And I think what he mentions, he was very vague about this statement, but he mentions, I believe, the tactics that Ukraine is going to utilize for next year. That is one of my questions for you guys as well. What are you looking forward for next year for 2024? You can answer me in the comment section. It could be even a personal thing for you if you want to learn Ukrainian or whatever. But be more interested to hear about, for Ukraine, what is something that you're looking forward for next year, or that you think is going to happen for Ukraine. So you can answer me in the comment section. I'll comment about it. But what he said, Zaluzhny, today is that he's expecting a much different type of war next year, that they have identified the problems that, we've talked about this year. They have identified what they can improve on, and 90% of these issues that they have, they found solutions on them. So again, it was very vague. It wasn't very clear what exactly the problems were, but Zaluzhny mentions that they're working actively to constantly, draw out new tactics and try to outsmart the enemy, which is excellent, and I like that type of approach. And I think what he talks about is that in 2023 we talked a lot about Russians catching up to Ukraine. So unfortunately, Ukraine is Russia's best teacher, right? As much as we like to belittle the Russian army and how it's essentially an army of convicts and criminals and things like that, there still is an experience component to the military, and they can still do so much damage, and they have a lot of power. And so it's also belittling and putting down the great heroism from the Ukrainian side, because they're not just fighting just some small tiny army or mindless soldiers. They're also fighting against very experienced soldiers that might be brainwashed, but they have experience. So he mentions that essentially Russia is caught up, technologically speaking, especially when we're talking about the drones. Russia's mass producing drones, whether it be from Iran with the Shaheeds or the FPV drones, they've caught up to that as well. Also, electronic warfare, which Russia does very well as well, with EW systems to block signals of drones flying, Ukrainian drones, or even access to internet or mobile networks. Russia's really developed that sphere of military into big advantage. So of course, I think that's what he's talking about, Zaluzhny, about the fact that Russia's caught up to Ukraine's technology, small technological edge that they've had. And also the fact that one of the things that I enjoy about Zaluzhny is that he's very humble and truthful, and he can admit mistakes. A person that can admit mistakes and being wrong is something that I really appreciate of a person, because we're not perfect whatsoever. I can sometimes make mistakes in my comments, my opinions, or but agreeing that we don't know everything and that sometimes we make mistakes is very important. And Zaluzhny mentioned that one of his biggest mistakes for 2023 was the fact that he thought that eventually the huge losses that Russia has been having in 2023 would stop them, right? It would detract them. And that hasn't happened. And so that is one thing that Zaluzhny admitted, is that he didn't think the Russians would just be okay with continuing with the amount of losses that they've been having for this entire year. And despite all these huge losses, they continue on. They continue on advancing and attacking, and just the footage that's coming out of these, especially of Divka, the carelessness, the bodies littering literally everywhere, the fields of Avdiivka, full of Russian corpses mostly, is horrifying. And nobody's even worried to try to recover them, bring them back home. You see these Russian men walking over these dead corpses, picking up a helmet here, a gun sight there, maybe an ammunition there, and just the pure carelessness from Russia's side is really, it's something that I totally didn't expect, and I think that most of us did. And I think Zaluzhny is correct, that was one thing that he made a mistake on. So Vicky mentions that I hope Ukraine can raise more troops so they can rotate soldiers more. Yeah, that is a good point. That brings also the topic of the mobilization of 500,000 men. So a new mobilization, which Zelensky talked about. Now, Zaluzhny, interestingly enough, today mentioned that that wasn't the 500,000 mark was not a request from the military command, so he wasn't part of this decision, which I thought was surprising, because you would think that the military should have a say about it. But for sure, there's no denying that Ukraine always needs fresh new troops. And I think what is the main difference between Ukraine and Russia is obviously it's the behavior that Zaluzhny and Zelensky have on human life, right? It's for Ukraine, it's about how can they save human lives as much as possible. Whereas for Russia, is it doesn't matter what the numbers are. We have millions of people, just completely different philosophies on the human life. So I think that this is something to be appreciated from the military command and also from the Ukrainian government, is that there is no disregard to human life. There is an interest in trying to preserve as many lives as possible. That is to not send Ukrainian soldiers to certain death on certain death missions. So um, yeah, that is very important. So thank you for this comment, Vicky. Paul Deberitz mentions, for 2024, I look forward to the Ukrainian Armed Forces of Ukraine, allies liberating Moscow and St. Petersburg. I don't think that's the goal. Again, as I mentioned a few minutes earlier, my personal goal, and I think most Ukrainian people want to liberate their own borders. There is no planning. And I don't think the goal should be to go to Moscow and St. Petersburg. Let the Russians deal with their own problems. They have the right to their state, and I could care less in what type of shape or form Russia is going to be after Ukraine victory to liberate its own territories, but not go after Russia. Ukraine should not be attacking Russia, invading Russia, and taking their territory. I am completely against that. It's a waste of time, and let the Russians deal with their own problems. Exactly as Robert said, unfortunately, it's a zombie state. It's a brainwashed zombie state. Now, one thing I need to mention is that that's the fine line. Is of course the unfortunate thing is that are we really going to be able to influence Russia by simply just letting them deal with their own issues when there's an internal collapse? I think there should be some involvement to punish all the Russians that were involved in this brutal invasion, whether it be the the clique, Putin's clique, or the military command, or some of the propagandists. I think there needs to be Mossad type of cleanup on these Russians that permitted the genocide of Ukrainians and calling out actively on a daily basis the genocide of Ukrainians. And you're not going to be able to do that if you're not going to be able to control Russia to a certain extent or have direct involvement within Russia. But I don't agree with invading Russia and I don't know, like taking Moscow and St. Petersburg. Like there's just not, there's no resources for that, unfortunately. So that's the fine line. What is going to happen after? It's a huge question, right? There's definitely going to be a power vacuum within Russia, but is the West, will the free world intervene to control this power vacuum and perhaps take control over the Russian government? I don't know, and I'm not sure if I want to see that. Or it's a question that is very open, and I don't think there is a right or wrong answer here. But for sure, the Russians need to feel some sort of embarrassment for what they've committed in Ukraine. They need to be punished, like what we've seen with Germany and Japan. And unfortunately, you can't really do that if you don't have a direct involvement into their politics, their education, or re education. Zelensky is a phenomenal, selfless leader, great advocate for Ukraine. Yeah, one thing I respect about Zelensky, as I've mentioned, I'm not going to put him on the pedestal, but the fact that he stayed in Ukraine on in February 2022, and he did not leave Ukraine. That was a huge, important moment in Ukrainian history, because that's what really set it in stone that Ukraine is going to fight until the very end. They're not going to just flee. So that I have a lot of respect for. Now, let me read some more of your comments about 2024. Zelensky. Ta-da. I don't see Ukraine launching counteroffensive same time next year, though. Need longer to train requisition combat power. Yeah. Again, in terms of is there going to be a Ukrainian counteroffensive in 2024? I think what we're seeing right now is Lelat Bank. I think this could be the new push that Ukraine is going to try to have in 2024. We'll see, but I think now for next year, it's all about preserving the lines and trying to cripple the Russian state from within. I think there needs to be active involvement in the Russian elections to try to throw as much dirt as possible on Putin. We know that he's going to get reelected. I mean, he's going to kill whoever he needs to kill to get in power, right? Even if there is going to be, somebody else is going to run for president, we know what the fate of that person will be, whether it be in prison or it's just a puppet that Putin put in just to make the appearance that he has, there's free elections. But we know who the winner is going to be. So Ukraine needs to continuously throw dirt and make him look as illegitimate as possible, that he is this old man, an old fart that's been ruling you guys for 23 years. I have no deny that most of the Russians are completely fine with that, and they like Putin as their Tsar. But I think that's still destabilizing, make the Russians think that is your Tsar really that strong is really important, and to start really building these cracks in the foundation that exist in the Kremlin right now. I'd like to visit Lviv. Yes, Lviv, in my opinion, is the most beautiful Ukrainian city. Lviv is historic. Lviv has a lot of different, cultures that existed. It was once part of Poland. So there's a lot of Catholic, Ukrainian Orthodox architecture. So Lviv is a beautiful, beautiful city. So I highly recommend you guys, if one time you want to go to Ukraine, some of you, obviously, after the war, Lviv is definitely worth a shot. It's a beautiful part of Ukraine. Um, Maybe the Far East regions will rise up. Yeah, I think there is a hope about that. Siberia, the Far East, the Urals. You know, there's a lot of minorities in Russia, and that is one of the main reasons as well. Putin has been mostly mobilizing the the people from these poor regions, these minorities, where it be Buryats, Chechens, Dagestanis, different types of cultures that Putin is putting first in the wave of mobilization, because he knows that there are going to be problematic. They're going to be the very first ones that are going to rise up against him eventually. So he wants to get rid as of many of these minorities as possible. A beautiful castle built near Lviv by a former Lithuanian, I think. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of Polish, Lithuanian architecture from from that era as well. It's a very historic city, right? So it's a very well preserved city as well. Unfortunately, the less nicer parts are from the post-Soviet era, where the Khrushchevkas, so these like very typical Soviet apartments, were built all over Soviet cities, like Lviv, Kiev, Moscow. So that is the unfortunate legacies, that you have this beautiful historic part of Lviv, but then you have a lot of these lesser, not as beautiful areas. But I mean, Ukraine's working hard to kind of rebuild these neighborhoods, whether it be in Lviv or Kiev. But that is the unfortunate legacy of decades of Soviet presence in Ukraine as well. Yeah, I visit Ukraine now. If you can, Lviv and Kiev are relatively safe. Safe. Yeah, I mean, it's up to you guys. Again, visiting Ukraine, I wouldn't say safe, especially if we're considering the fact that Russia is launching missiles, and you never know what can happen. So, but once the war is over, I hope that many of you will go and visit Ukraine, because there's a lot of beautiful areas. There's the Carpathian Mountains as well, beautiful part, historic part of Ukraine, where you can do a lot of cool hiking and skiing. The south of Ukraine is fertile, beautiful land, very warm as well. You have Odessa, evidently, which is another beautiful Ukrainian city. And Kiev, I mean, it's the capital. Kiev's the heartland, and I will always love Kiev. It's just a very beautiful, beautiful city. And again, I can only hope that these cities will improve and become better once Ukraine wins, right? And becomes more international and starts reinvesting into itself. I think that there's a lot of potential in turning some of these cities into really world-class cities as well. So expensive to get there from the United States right now. Yeah, I agree. I mean, a flight ticket from North America to Europe or Ukraine are extremely expensive, especially Ukraine, evidently, because of just very few airlines probably flying to Kiev right now. As reported last week, the first commercial airliner left the Boryspil airport in Kiev last week. But I don't think it's going to be like a weekly thing. I think it's going to be on and off. But it's good news as well, because there's going to be more diplomats coming into Ukraine. There's not going to be a reason anymore. Well, I can't come. Well, we have an open airport. You can come at any time, right? So that allows more open avenues for diplomatic relations with different countries, or solidify diplomatic relations, right? And have more, more of these diplomats from different countries. Would be the United States, Britain, France, Germany, coming to Ukraine and showing support, which is also very important, and discussing important matters as well as Zelensky, or whether it be with Zaluzhny, with important stakeholders. The Ukraine export corridor to the Black Sea is the biggest success story of this year from a long-term logistics perspective. I fully agree with your statement here, Jamie. That is the embarrassment that the Russian Black Sea fleet has faced this year. They were saying we're going to enforce, our policies against Ukrainian ships, or ships going to Ukraine to pick up the grain, and then they were utterly embarrassed, and 20% of their fleet was sunk since February, so 2022. So I think that this is a huge win as well, because Ukraine was also able to sell most of its grain and export it which is extremely important, right? This is a huge part of the Ukrainian economy, is the agrarian economy, is the grain that Ukraine is trying to sell to hundreds of millions of people in the developing world, whether it be in Northern Africa or in Asia. Ukraine has been selling them to a lot of countries that rely on this supply of staple basic foods. So this is a very big win. I agree with you, Jamie. Okay. It is sad Ukraine can attack the south before mining. F-16s might stop the Russian gliding bombs, but how to go through mines? Yeah, and that's one of the points that one of my viewers mentioned earlier today in my live stream, that Ukraine needs to also somewhat start thinking about mass producing demining equipment to be able to really quickly demine, certain areas, whether it be for even offensives or just reconquer its own land, and then to have to demine. It's a huge feat. It's a huge task ahead. So mass producing demining equipment is definitely one of those things that Ukraine needs to start doing itself, because the West hasn't really provided a lot of this. They have provided a few tanks here and there, some different Abrams variants, I think, that were like demining tanks, but Ukraine doesn't have nearly enough to be able to really pull through a huge offensive, because the Russians will really rely mostly on their mining, right, for an effective defense, and it has worked for them. The Surovikin line has worked relatively well for the Russians. This multi-echelon defense. How is Ukraine's grain support to China? Yeah, I think that also Ukraine has been providing some grain to China. So that is, I think, another reason why Ukraine really wanted to unblock this Russian blockade. And I think that this is one of the friction points between Russia and China, is like, hey, China's like, we need that grain, and Russia's like, well, we're in control of the Black Sea. And so China should be very grateful that Ukraine unblocked that themselves, to allow also the free transit and export of its grain to China, because China also evidently relies on Ukraine grain. Joey says he agrees with Vicky. I think Ukraine needs to launch a major advertising campaign in the United States to gather support. Yeah, I'm not sure about the ethics behind that. Can another country, publicize, or maybe indirectly publicize, try to really start? I don't know how that would happen, but yeah, the United States, there is a lack of understanding of, as I said, the global implications of the war between Russia and Ukraine right now, and what kind of long term effects it would have if Russia would win, which I seriously don't think is going to happen. But if we allow ourselves to become chilled out and relaxed and being like, well, this war's been ongoing for years, and you feel that a little bit. People forget about this conflict now. Well, I mean, that's going to be problematic. So yeah, I agree that some more education, whether it be in Canada or the United States or in the free world, about like, we need to continue with our support. Don't forget what's currently ongoing in Ukraine, and that also your support is making and building jobs for the Americans. As I said my last live stream, this is also kind of restarting the defense industry of the United States. Not that it went away completely, but it has definitely slowed down. And now you have Raytheon, you have more orders for Lockheed Martin. Many different defense industries are really waking up, whether it be even the steel factories that are producing important steel and metals for just any type of weapons that the United States is utilizing. Really restarting those fires in those factories is very important, and it's bringing back jobs to the American people. So this is also a very good investment, because having a good defense industry is always optimal for peace, in my opinion. And I think that obviously the United States adjusted because it was less of a threat in the last few years. But since the Russian invasion, I think there's been a lot of countries woke up from that, and realized, holy crap, we need to start investing back into our military, making sure that we're independent as best as we can be. Um. Okay, so Surfer Dust says UK still finding World War II incendiary ordnance. Imagine clearing millions of mines. Sucks. Yeah, yeah, for sure. You have these one and off stories, where it'd be in France from World War One, where they found, another bomb that was that didn't detonate or a mine, or as you said, surfer in the United Kingdom with an incendiary ordinance that they just found out. That is the legacy that the Russians have left in Ukraine. It sucks. Absolutely agree with you. Predictions for next year: Russia ruble collapses. We'll see. I mean, one thing is that when it comes down to the economy, you can never predict what's going to happen. I mean, for anything, actually, you can't really predict what's going to happen exactly. But um, the Russian ruble has been, you know, it never had any value in the beginning, but now you can see that the value compared to the US dollar is only increasing. And it's really been prepped up by the Russian central bank right now. But, you know, the ruble is a rubble. Or yeah, exactly, as I said, is artificial propped up, so collapse will be eventual. Yeah. Jamie, would you support the recalling of Ukrainian communities outside of the motherland to live again in Ukraine? Should it be enforced, incentivized? No, I mean, I don't agree with that either. A lot of Ukrainians left for a reason, and like as I said myself, I'm settled in Canada, and I think the Ukrainians that stayed, they stayed because they love Ukraine, and I think that that's just there should be freedom of movement. Right now, it's limited, of course, because Ukraine needs men for mobilization, and Ukraine is facing an existential threat, literally an existential threat. If Russia wins, there's not going to be Ukraine anymore. And don't think that the Russians will be so kind to the Ukrainians, especially after 2 years of brutal defense. The Russians will absolutely commit genocides of the level of the Holocaust or the Holodomor that happened in the 1930s in Ukraine, where Stalin imposed artificial famines on the Ukrainian people, sealed the borders, and then killed off millions of Ukrainian people, which went under the radar because there was no free press in the Soviet Union. So there's a few American and I think British journalists that got access of what was going on in Ukraine. And you could see just the brutal images of Ukrainians absolutely starving and then eating their own dead or rats. And my own family was impacted by this. And this is exactly what the Russians are going to do. And that's what they were planning to do in the beginning of this invasion. I was talking about it in one of my videos that Putin was planning to steal and take away all of the Ukrainian grain after successful takeover and destroying the Zelensky government. And so there's no denying that the Russians, if they win, they will commit mass genocide on the Ukrainian people. So this is an existential question. So that's why right now, of course, I don't agree with the absolute free movement of all Ukrainian people, because Ukraine needs men. And I know that some of them might not be willing to, and that is, the unpleasant also situations that there are some Ukrainians that don't want to fight, right? And I understand it. It's not easy. You're being mobilized and your life is on the line. But when you're thinking about the existential question of your country not existing tomorrow and facing a greater threat from, you perhaps dying in the front line, or you dying as a slave and being mistreated by Russians, I think the answer to which situation you think would be better, I think, is dying with a weapon in your hand and being able to fight against a brutal oppressor like Russia. It's very, very hard, and I know that it's easier said than done. Mobilize more men. You know, every life is an asset, in my opinion. But Ukraine just, unfortunately, is facing this existential question. So it has no choice but to try to mobilize and find efficiencies within this mobilization. And as I've said, and this is something that Zelensky mentioned, is that they're trying to make it more efficient. So it's not just you're mobilized, you go in the army. It's about you. What kind of skills do you have, and what kind of skills can you apply in the current war effort that is going to help Ukraine? It could be a logistics officer, it could be a nurse, it could be a doctor. Just some men working in a warehouse, moving, shells and ammunition boxes to trucks. Right? Everybody has a different skill set. So I think that this is another thing that Zelensky mentioned, is that really trying to um, not just force people into becoming soldiers or men becoming just going to the army, but reinforcing what kind of skill set they have and really putting it to best use during this war effort. Cheryl, you mentioned absolutely. So thank you for supporting. Would you support? Yeah, so that already answered. Any thoughts or hearing anything in the Ukrainian expat community regarding President Zelensky's recent call for expanded recruitment? of the Ukrainian armed forces? Not really. I haven't heard much. I mean, again, this is really an internal question. You're not going to really have a lot of talk about this outside of Ukraine. But as I mentioned, what was interesting is Zelensky had a press conference today, and he said that he didn't really require the 500,000 men. This wasn't something that was asked by the military command. So this was a number that Zelensky gave. So it's kind of interesting as to why there's no real sort of there's disparity here between the military command and the government. But for sure, there's always a need for mobilization, and that is one thing that I wanted to finish this video with, is that I think Ukraine needs to make a mandatory military service within the Ukrainian nation, like what we see in Israel or Switzerland. Unfortunately, Ukraine will have Russia by its borders, whether it likes it or not. So Ukraine needs to start preparing its future generations to be ready for any type of military attack from Russia. So I think Ukraine also needs to make it mandatory for everyone to at least train and serve for a year or two, like in Israel. I think that is very important. Um, Conscripts might be bad soldiers, but they can be used in other areas like storemen, logistics. Yeah, exactly. That's what I was saying. So Ukraine is trying to make it an efficient process as well. Yeah. Vance is asking me, what are your predictions for Ukraine-Russia war? As I said, nobody can predict what's going to happen. Like if you're just asking me if you think Ukraine's going to win or Russia's going to win, I certainly hope Ukraine's going to win, and I have full optimism and belief that Ukraine's going to win. But predictions. There's so many predictions, and how many predictions have we heard and listened to that failed? So the first one was Russia is never going to attack Ukraine, and here we are. So some of the brightest generals mentioned that that would never happen, or actually that Russia is a great superpower that will challenge NATO. And we know that Russia jokingly is the second best army in Ukraine after Ukraine. Now, as I said, of course, I don't want to belittle the Russian military. And I think that it's really on par right now with the Ukrainian military. There is a parity between both, right? So the issue with Ukraine is just it doesn't have the numbers. That's the only problem. That's the one factor that is very difficult to change. If you don't have the numbers, that is not something you can accelerate. It takes time, literally. So unfortunately, that is one of the biggest issues that Ukraine is having, is the numbers, quantity, whether it be manpower, whether it be tanks, whether it be ammunition, support as well, or the reliable support. The numbers just aren't there for Ukraine yet. And so Ukraine, has to fight another war of convincing its partners to always give its support, right? So that is difficult as well. So I think that's going to be the live stream for today, guys. We've talked about so many things. Again, thank you for joining. I really hope that you guys had a great Christmas, and I hope that you will have a great new year. For 2024, one thing I want to see happen is the Crimea bridge down. I want it to be destroyed, and I hope that's going to happen very, very soon. We're going to have maybe a New Year Christmas present, or New Year present, another New Year present. I can only hope that can happen, but I think that one thing for 2024 is I would like the Kerch Bridge to be leveled off and the Russians not being able to utilize it anymore. That would be a huge embarrassment for Putin, who invested billions of dollars on the 2024 bridge. So again, a Merry Christmas to you all. Hope you guys enjoyed it. You had some great gifts, some good conversations with your family and friends. I'm wishing you a very great new year, a lot of health. The most important thing is health. I hope that all of you will be healthy, mentally and physically. I think it's really important. That is, the older you become, the more you realize how health is the number one thing that you can wish for anyone. So that's one thing I wish for you all, is just absolutely great health. I love you all, guys. Thank you for your support. And I hope, next year we're going to be making a lot of videos and getting closer and closer to this victory. So, yeah, thank you again for your support. And I will see you in the next one. Slava Ukraini!